Gas attack! Shut the door!
The Battlebox, beginnings of a bunker. The Battlebox was built in 1936 and completed in 1939. It comprised 26 rooms and was part of the Malaya Command Headquarters. The bunker was originally intended as headquarters for the combined operations staff of Army, Navy, and Air Force to ensure cooperation in the event of war. This headquarters, however, was already too small by the time it was completed. Although it was occupied during operations, it was never actually used for the purpose intended. Instead, a new premises for the Combined Operations Headquarters of Malaya Command was built at Sinai Road. Throughout the Malayan campaign, General Officer Commanding GOC Malaya, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, worked from Sinai Road until 4 days before the fall of Singapore to the invading Japanese forces. The control of anti-aircraft guns operations, i.e. the planning, the plotting of air movement and control of anti-aircraft positions, the Naval Extended Defense Office, which controlled the sea lanes off Singapore, and Fortress Command, which was responsible for the defense of Singapore, remained at the Battlebox. The Fortress Commander for Singapore was Major General F. Keith Simmons. In February 1942, 4 days to a fall. On the 11th February 1942, Lieutenant General Tomiyuki Yamashita, commander of the invading Japanese forces, had written a letter to Percival calling for him to surrender Singapore. For the 65 days since 8 September 1941, when they landed at Kota Baru in Peninsula Malaya and Singora and Batani in Thailand, the Japanese army had swept down the entire peninsula, defeating the defending Allied forces despite fierce resistance offered at the towns of Kampar, Slim River, and Muar. On the night of 8 February 1942, the Japanese forces began the invasion of Singapore. By the dawn of 11th February, they were at Jurong Road, while Bukit Timah had been seized. 29 copies of Yamashita's letter in wooden boxes were dropped by Japanese aircraft. Percival, however, had no means to reply. In his report to Headquarters, Southwest Pacific Command, he wrote, "Letter was dropped by air. Have no means of dropping message, so do not propose to make reply, which would, of course, in any case, be negative." That same morning, at 0745 hours, Percival moved his headquarters from Simei Road, which was now being threatened, to Fort Canning. The general staff worked from the Battlebox. For Percival, the Battlebox was never meant to hold as many bodies as this, and the ventilating arrangements were inadequate. In consequence, the general staff's room became terribly hot, and the staff worked under most unpleasant conditions. The Chinese soldiers from the Singapore Volunteer Force once nicknamed the Battlebox the Dungeon, because it was poorly ventilated and crammed. By the end of 11th February, the Allied forces had been forced back to the Makrichi Reservoir and Racecourse Village areas. Percival noted that the loss of food and petrol dumps in the Bukit Timah area was a very serious blow. We now had only 14 days military food supplies in the depots. The Indian-based hospital at Tyersall was set on fire by enemy action and practically burnt up. There was a large number of casualties among the patients. Orderlies. Tight security was the main feature of the Battlebox, owing to its highly sensitive functions. Only officers, men with authorization, and those with a need to enter the facility were given access. Soldiers were not allowed to venture beyond the rooms they were assigned for their duties. No smoking, no eating, and no talking signs were put up as reminders, and each room was supposed to be locked, to be accessed only by its respective personnel. The men who worked here barely saw one another. They communicated via telephones and a suction pipe by which they passed paper messages. Soldiers had to leave the complex immediately after their shift. The orderlies could have been the only one within the complex that provided respite from the tense atmosphere of the other rooms. This was where men from the ranks would rest when taking breaks during their shift. It is not hard to imagine that here could have been a place where they reflected and exchanged news on the war from the outbreak of hostilities till the very end. The place where the sinking of the HMS Prince of Wales and the HMS Repulse would have been discussed. The orderly room. The battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse were sunk on 10th December 1941 by Japanese bomber and torpedo aircraft. The two ships were part of a naval force, Force Z, led by Admiral Tom Phillips, to surprise the Japanese landings. The ships had been sent by the Admiralty as a sign of reassurance and force. Force Z was a modified form of the Singapore strategy, a series of evolving war plans that saw the basing of a major fleet at the Singapore Naval Base that was opened in 1938 as a means, 1938 as a means of defense and deterrence. The sinking of these two ships was the first time in history that battleships had been sunk by air power in open sea. The lives of 848 men and boys were lost. Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, later wrote in his memoirs that in all the war he had never received a more direct shock than when he received the news of the sinking. As I turned over and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor, who were hastening back to California. Over all this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked. Here are pictures of the Prince of Wales sinking. War came to Singapore on the morning of 8th December 1941, the same day the Japanese forces landed in Kota Baru, Patani, and Singora. As Percival reported in his dispatch on operations, at about 0430 hours, a Japanese air formation raided Singapore area. It had presumably come from French Indochina, a distance of about 700 miles. The air raid alarm was sounded, but Singapore was not completely blacked out when the aircraft arrived. Bombs were dropped on the Seletar and Tengah aerodromes and in the city area, but the damage was slight. This was the first indication that the citizens of Singapore had that war had broken out in the Far East. 61 people were killed and 133 injured. Here's a picture of the bombing on December 8th. The telephone exchange. For the Allied forces, communication over telephone wires was more secure than communications by radio. Telephone communications thus played a vital role in the defense of Singapore. Graffiti found on the walls of this room indicates that Malaya Command was linked to other telephone exchanges at Mount Faber, Black Mati, now known as Sentosa Island, Pulau Bukom, Changi, Alexander Barracks, and other British military establishments. The exchange was also connected to most civilian switchboards throughout Malaya. For security reasons, code names were used instead of real names. Code names were made up of selecting 4 random letters from the alphabet, and they were exchanged every 48 hours. At the beginning of the war, however, there were delays in communications from the front to the battle box, as the front line headquarters for the battles fought in northern Malaya were connected to Fort Canning through the ordinary civilian telephone exchange. In fact, even the signal office in Kuala Lumpur was connected to the battle box through these means. As Duncan Wilson, who worked at the signal office in Kuala Lumpur, recalls, in survival was for me. For the rest of our shift, we were putting calls through as fast as we could. We had a 60-line switchboard and 2 of us to operate it. Obviously, many calls were to headquarters far east at Singapore, and the delay was around 45 minutes before we could get through the civilian exchanges. The primary code was eventually decided for all calls with first priority to Percival. Thus, scramble phone to Fort Canning, followed by the others. Also, it was only after Percival's insistence that the telegraph company allowed Kuala Lumpur 1 direct line for their sole use to Fort Canning. Harry Chew Kwee Hock, 1920 to 2003, who was a member of the Singapore Fortress Signals Company, recalls being able to hear the telephone operator's conversation from next door, the orderly from the orderly's room. It seemed that there was more than one operator, maybe 2, as they would be heard arguing about whose turn it was to pick up the call.
It is, sir. I'll call you back when he's free.
The destruction of road and railway bridges was, in Percival's words, obviously essential if we were to succeed in our efforts to delay the enemy, and it had, in fact, been done since the beginning of the operation. Percival estimated that some 300 bridges were destroyed to varying degree as the withdrawal continued. However, he also noted that the rapidity in which the Japanese made temporary repairs were remarkable, even allowing for the fact that in most cases ample material was available near the bridge site. The Cipher Office. The Cipher section, with its responsibility of coding and decoding messages, was a very important part of the defense of Singapore. Coding would have been done with the help of manuals and slide rules. Messages were supposed to be burnt after 3 days. There was also a shredding machine in this room, which was meant to destroy sensitive documents. However, during the Battle of Singapore in 1942, the main power was disrupted by Japanese bombing. The emergency power generator in the bunker had a power capacity that was incompatible with the shredding machine. Thus, when the order came to destroy all sensitive documents on the day of surrender, 15 February 1942, all the papers had to be burnt instead. In the Cipher Office, there would also have been one signal officer and 2 or 3 clerks. The coding plants were here, but when the situation became bad, they were shifted elsewhere for security purposes. The room was eventually left empty when the cipher function was moved out, and the British NCO subsequently used it as a sleeping room. Those who are near this room remember it to be always locked. There is, however, a tragic postscript to the destroying of code books and a miscommunication. British modern pentathlete Geoffrey Brooke, 1920 to 2009, who served on the HMS Prince of Wales and who later escaped from Singapore, recounts in his book Singapore's Dunkirk, the incident of the flotilla of small ships and light craft carrying evacuees from Singapore to Batavia, present-day Jakarta, on the night of 13 to 14 February 1942, that ran into an invading Japanese force comprising a carrier, cruisers, and destroyers. The fleet apparently did not receive prior warning, part of the reason being the assumption that any messages received would have been indecipherable. Now we'll look at the situation maps. Here we have a chart showing the dispositions of the 9th Indian Division, 27th Australian Brigade. Here we have 800 Australians and 400 Indians. Here we have the 53rd Infantry Brigade and the 2nd Loyals attached, the 2nd Cambridgeshires, the 11th Indian Division. Here's a Malayan Infantry Brigade, and another Malayan Infantry Brigade, Indian Infantry Brigade, and some special volunteer forces. Here we have an air attack by the enemy. And here is where the Japanese were ambushed on 23rd, 1st, 42. That would be January 23rd. Here we have 2 battalions of the Australians here. We have a detachment up here. Here's 1 Indian battalion and 2 Malayan infantry brigades. And here we have the area of Singapore. As the battle progressed, here we have the beginnings of forces still holding on. Here the road is still clear. The West Force, the Indian Corps, the Malayan Corps with Australians, and here is the small force of Australians on the west coast, with 1 big battalion over here. Here we see the beginning of the withdrawal with these forces moving that way. These guys are still holding on here. Here we have maps of the area and propaganda posters warning people to be quiet. Here is the signal office. War veterans refer to this room as the post office. This was the room where messages arrived and left. It was occupied by almost 7 men, well, about 7 men per shift. 3 signalmen, 2 orderlies, and 2 clerks. Towards the surrender, however, there were sometimes only 2 signalmen on duty. The shift hours were arranged by the headquarters of Royal Corps of Signals. There were 4 shifts per day, 7 a.m. to 1 p.m., 1 p.m. to 7 p.m., 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., and 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The signal office was not locked like the rest of the rooms because ventilation was poor, and the signalmen did not like it. In a normal situation, the day would have started off with the signalmen receiving a situation report that would be passed to the signal officer, who would then pass it to General Percival. The 3 signalmen would be signaling while the orderly was seated next to the door leading to the signal control room. would be relaying messages from the signalman to the officers in the signal control room. The orderly, who was seated nearer to the two clerks, ran errands for his shipmates, like getting refreshments. The two clerks did the paperwork. There was to be no talking nor discussion. Some of the messages mentioned code words to be used during an imminent air raid or other anticipated events, while the main type of messages received concerned troop movements. For Harry Chu Kui Hawk, who worked as a signaler at the Battlebox, two messages stood out during his time there when he was interviewed. War with Japan is inevitable, and when the code word raffles is signaled, it means total blackout. Recalls British Army officer Eric Lomax in his award-winning book The Railway Man about his time as a signal officer in the Battlebox in the last month of the Malayan campaign. I went in and didn't come out for 3 weeks. The siege of Singapore for me was a series of clipped shouts for help over the radio and terse bulletins of disaster. I spent most of my time underground, hearing and relaying orders, passing on information, sending out instructions for desperate combinations of units to try to stop the collapse. Here we have further progress with the Western forces falling back. The Australian fellows have fallen back to here. These guys are falling back here. The Bren gun carriers, or universal carrier, was a common name describing light armored track vehicles built by Vickers Armstrongs and other companies. About 5,000 of them were made in Australia, incorporating several features of Australian design, which is said to be an improvement from the original. A newspaper report on 26 December 1941 in the Cairns Post said that after its use in spectacular maneuvers in Malaya recently, Sir Robert Brooke Popham, British Commander-in-Chief in the Far East, congratulated the men on their handling of a weapon which he described as being admirably suited to the type of warfare most likely to be encountered in Malaya. February 1942, 3 days to a fall. On Malaya Command's second day at the Battlebox, the situation worsened on all fronts. Percival recorded in his dispatch on operations that at 0900 hours, the Japanese forces had attacked with tanks on the Bukit Timah Road front and almost reached the Chinese high school area. After a visit there, Percival formed the opinion that there was real danger that the enemy would break through on that front into Singapore town. And after consultation, he decided that it was time to organize a close perimeter defense around Singapore town itself. The plan, however, involved the withdrawal of all troops from the beach defenses on the north side of the island and also from the Changi area, resulting in the loss of the Changi coast defenses. Throughout the day, Percival also noted that Japanese aircraft and military had been active, resulting in a large number of casualties in the town area. By the end of the day, he noted that the administrative situation now began to cause anxiety. As a result of further withdrawals, there was only enough military food reserves under British control for 7 days, in addition to other reserves held by various units and the civil food reserves. Ammunition, however, were adequate, excepting for the 25-pounders, the Bofors, which are the anti-aircraft weapons, and mortars. Pearl's Hill water reservoir was empty, and the Fort Canning reservoir had begun to lose water rapidly. In the town area, bombing and shelling had resulted in breaks occurring in the main water supply pipes faster than repairs could be made. Water at low pressure was only available at certain street and ground floor levels. Evacuation of civilians, which had begun in early February, continued at Singapore Harbor. Summing up on the events of the day, Major General Gordon Bennett, commander of the Australian Imperial Forces, wrote in Why Singapore Fell that the end is near and that it is only a matter of days before the enemy will break through into the city. I fear the consequences of street fighting that will ensue, should that come to pass. There is no resistance left on the island, and every enemy attack makes progress. Yet there were those who held on. Recalled Chu Kim Seng, who was with the Dal Force, the Singapore Overseas Chinese Anti-Japanese Volunteer Army, in his interview in Eternal Vigilance, The Price of Freedom. 3 days before the British military surrendered, the British officers told us that the Singapore Overseas Chinese Anti-Japanese Volunteer Army would be disbanded in view of major shifts in the war situation. Senior officers of the British military openly praised our efforts, but what was the use? If we had not been disbanded, we would have been prepared to fight to the last man. Signal control. Up till the fall of Malaya, this room maintained direct contact with battlefronts in the north. Following the fall of Malaya, it was used only for communications within Singapore Island. This room was also reported to have overseas communications links with Hong Kong, India, and Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka. In this room, Morse code transmitters were used to communicate the more urgent messages, and as such, complete silence in this room was essential to distinguish the dots between the dashes in the code. A duty signal officer would have been stationed in this room. Today, a highlight of this room is the Japanese graffiti on the wall, showing clear evidence that the Japanese army once occupied the Battlebox and used it. When war photographer Jim Howard, he was also a lieutenant colonel in the Army, a wing commander in the Air Force, and a civilian, was parachuted into Singapore to liberate prisoners of war under the orders of the Australian Prime Minister at the time, he entered the Battlebox shortly after his arrival. Howard saw Japanese soldiers occupying this room and using the communication facilities, whilst the rooms nearby were barely furnished and littered. The orderlies' room, for example, had bunks and were occupied by Japanese guards who also cooked there. The telephone exchange still had its switchboard. Howard also remembered the stench of ammonia in the air. It is thus very probable that the Japanese did occupy and carry out substantial work in the Battlebox that was, however, limited to the signal section only. This was because it was the only section that had any use, that had direct communication links with other parts of Singapore. There was also a possibility that the Japanese military police, the Kempeitai, occupied the Battlebox for a while right after the surrender, until they occupied the former Young Men's Christian Association building, which was demolished in 1981. The Battle of Muar, fought sometime between 16th and 22nd January 1942, saw some of the fiercest resistance from the Allied forces. The battle, with major fighting at the towns of Bakri and Perak Sulong, has been regarded as the last major battle of the Malayan campaign. At Bakri, where the Australian soldiers launched a surprise attack on the Japanese forces on 19 January 1942, saw 10 Australians killed and 15 injured, while the casualties on the Japanese side amounted to 140 dead. Historian and author Alan Warren wrote in Singapore 1942, Britain's Greatest Defeat, that this was the first time in Malaya that a British Empire force had overrun a Japanese contingent and maintained control of the battlefield long enough to count the bodies of the fallen. Later, the fighting along the road down the south to Perak Sulong was for historian Brian Farrell in his Defense and Fall of Singapore, 1941-1942, the most intense battle of the entire campaign, reaching a level of ferocity that stands comparison with any other action on this scale in the Pacific War. Here on the right is an Australian 2-pounder anti-tank gun of the 2nd of the 4th Australian Anti-Tank Regiment, commanded by Sergeant Charles Parsons, left, firing on the Japanese Type 95 Ha-Go tanks as they tried to pass trees felled across the Muar, Parat Sulong Road, near Bakri in Malaya, 18th January 1942. 9 tanks were destroyed by 2 2-pounders in this engagement, part of the Battle of Muar, which took place around the Gimsa Bridge and the Muar River in Johor. Here we have further retreat, further falling back. And this battle would be around here, perhaps. Fortress Command. This room was occupied by the commander of Singapore Fortress, Major General F. Keith Simmons. He was responsible for the defense of Singapore and its adjoining islands, as well as the defenses at Pengerang on the southeast coast of Johor. He had under his command all the fixed defenses, being the following: coast defense guns and searchlights, the anti-aircraft defenses, the beach defense troops, the Straits Volunteer Force in Singapore, and fortress administration and administrative units. Said Percival of Simmons' responsibility in the war in Malaya, it was a pretty important command, especially as he also became heavily involved with civil problems connected with the defense of Singapore. In addition to this, he had the responsibility for the defense of the east coast of Johor, where the small port of Mersing, connected to Singapore by a good motor road, had always been thought to be a likely landing place for an invading force. For the defense of this area, he had to rely on what field troops could be made available from Singapore. Not a very satisfactory state of affairs, and one about which I never felt very happy. Simmons is fondly remembered by those who were with him in Singapore. On the occasion of his death in Melbourne in 1952, Gordon Bennett, who was Commander, Australian Imperial Force, during the Malayan Campaign, wrote, "The AIF Malaya will always remember General Keith Simmons as a fine soldier, a firm friend, a great Britisher." It is not difficult to imagine Percival during using this room and in discussion with Simmons when Percival was at the Battlebox from 11 February 1942 onwards. Fortress Command would have been the place in the complex where all incoming reports from the various fronts were gathered to allow Percival and Simmons an overview of the battle. The Empress of Asia was a former luxury ocean liner that was requisitioned for use as a troop carrier in World War I and then World War II. In her final voyage, she was sailing from Bombay, now Mumbai, India, to Singapore when on 5th February 1942 she was attacked by Japanese aircraft. The troops and crew on board made it all to shore and the ship sank off Sultan Shoal lighthouse. While there had been speculation as to the difference the weapons and equipment lost would have made to the outcome of the defense of Singapore, Percival noted this later. "I met the survivors on the quay. Splendid men, but no weapons. What a tragedy. But it was the only ship that was sunk of those bringing reinforcements, so we were really lucky." The capsized hull was salvaged after the war and the remnants removed in 2020 to ensure navigational safety at Turas Point. Artifacts recovered from the ship were displayed at the National Museum of Singapore's special exhibition, Dislocations, Memory and the Meaning of the Fall of Singapore, 1942. In 2022, to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the fall of Singapore. Here's the Empress of Asia sinking. Here's Percival and Simmons. Here we have the collapse of the defense line being pulled back to the city itself. The gun operations room. The gun operations room was in communication with fighter operations at Kallang Airfield. This was the room in the bunker from which the anti-aircraft guns and searchlights were controlled. Gun operations was overseen by Brigadier Alec Warren Greenlaw Wilding, who was commander anti-aircraft defenses. In the recollections of Hugh Lindley Jones, who had worked in the room as a gun control officer, he recalled that his role was to plot the progress of enemy air attacks on a large table map, using information received from radar stations and visual observers, to check that the evidence was credible and then pass it on to the various anti-aircraft gun sites around the island. They were then prepared to try to shoot down the planes and knew the general direction, numbers, and heights of the formations. The map was that of the entire Malayan Peninsula up to the Isthmus of Kra, so that one of the air bases at Alakstar in Kedah was also covered. As Lindley Jones recalled, the staff strength in the room comprised 2 duty officers and at least another 10 to 15 others plotting information that was incoming on the map and relaying news to the gun sites, mainly through land telephone lines. This room has been recreated with the help of oral description by a former serviceman who worked here to show the table map of the Malayan Peninsula and wooden markers which was used to plot and show the direction of the air raids. Here's a standard map, and here is the plotting table. Most popularly known as Zero, Japanese pilot called it Zero Sen, while its allied codename was Zeke, or more colloquially, Zero. The Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 21 Type 0 fighter is possibly the best known Japanese fighter aircraft of World War II. When the Pacific War broke out in December 1941, the Zero was said to be the best fighter in the Far East. It had outperformed its opponents in the Sino-Japanese War in 1940, and despite reports of its prowess, Allied pilots in Malaya were said to have been caught by surprise with the Zero's superiority in virtually all departments: speed, climbing ability, and maneuverability. Its top speed of 331 miles per hour was faster than of any Allied aircraft in the Malayan campaign. The Mitsubishi G3M Navy attack bomber, with the Allied reporting name of Nell, was the Imperial Japanese Navy's first land-based medium bomber. The Nell played a key role in the sinking of the battleship HMS Prince of Wales on 10th December 1941. The aircraft could be armed with either 1,760-pound torpedo or a similar bomb load for 2.365 nanometers. In this photograph, the Nell is likely to have been painted white with a green cross, indicating that it was part of Green Cross flights by the Japanese after the surrender of Japan in 1945. These were flights of delegations and of surrendering aircraft to assembly points and general communications and taking surrender details to outlying forces.
The single-engine aircraft in the photograph on the left is the Ki-43 with the Allied reporting name Oscar. The Ki-43 first saw combat in the Malayan campaign. Allied pilots initially had difficulty in telling the Ki-43 apart from the Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 21 Type O Zeke, or Zero, as both aircraft were similar in appearance, and the Allies did not know that the Japanese forces had introduced a new aircraft. In Mark Still's Malaya and Dutch East Indies 1941-42, Japan's air power shocks the world, the Oscar was said to be a formidable opponent when in the hands of experienced pilots. The twin-engine aircraft in the photograph is the Ki-46-2 with the Allied reporting name of Dinah, also used in the Malayan campaign. This reconnaissance aircraft was capable of high speed and achieving high altitude, making it largely impervious to Allied fighters in Southeast Asia. The photograph on the right shows several Ki-43 as well as a Kawasaki Ki-100 with model paintwork. The Kawasaki Ki-100 made its combat debut in March 1945, and when in the hands of a capable pilot, it was said to be as formidable as the best of the Allied aircraft. Here are Malayan soldiers inspecting the remains of a Japanese plane which it was brought down by British fire. And on the left, Malaya, the remains of the tail of a Japanese airplane which was brought down by British fire. 13th February 1942, Black Friday, 2 days to a fall. Superstitious would no doubt look upon Friday, 13th February as a day of ill omen, and so it proved to be. A.E. Percival, The War in Malaya. At 1400 hours, Percival held a conference with his commanders at Fort Canning. Those present included Major General Gordon Bennett, commander of the Australian Imperial Forces, Lieutenant General Heath, commander of the 3rd Indian Corps, Major General Keith Simmons, Fortress commander, and Lieutenant Colonel L.C. Thomas, commander of the Tom Force, a hastily assembled force to counterattack the Japanese Army's attack at Bukit Timah, and other staff officers from Malaya Command. At this conference, in which the future conduct of operations was discussed, Percival indicated that he had hoped to organize a counterattack to relieve the pressure on the defenses. His commanders felt otherwise. As Gordon Bennett recalls of the meeting in Why Singapore Fell, all were unanimous that a situation had arrived when further resistance was hopeless. The troops were exhausted, even the lately arrived 18th Division being done, according to its commander. Stores of ammunition were being rapidly depleted, the troops were falling back, and the morale of most was extremely low. In reply to his commander's response, Percival said he did not have permission from General Sir Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, ABDA-COM, to surrender. He also said that, "I have my honor to consider, and there is also the questions of what posterity will think of us if we surrender the large army and the valuable fortress." Percival later wrote that he then replied, "You need not bother about your honor. You lost that a long time ago up north." Nevertheless, Percival formed the opinion that the situation was undoubtedly grave, but was not hopeless. The interests of the civil population, which was estimated at that time to number nearly 1 million, could not, in my view, be entirely disregarded. He wrote to Wavell, asking him for permission to be given wider discretionary powers, only to be told that continued action was essential, and to continue to inflict the maximum damage on the enemy for as long as possible. At the same time, Percival also gave orders for the destruction of the oil stocks at Pulau Bukom. On the same day, the Director General for Civil Defense, Ivan Simpson, recalled in Singapore, too little too late, that the municipal water engineer warned me that complete water failure was imminent. Scenes of devastation could be seen everywhere on the streets of Singapore when Gordon Bennett made his way back to his headquarters. As he wrote later, bombs were falling in a nearby street. On reaching the spot, one saw that the side of the building had fallen on an air raid shelter. A group of Chinese, Malays, Europeans, and Australian soldiers were already at work shoveling and dragging the debris away. Soon there emerged from the shelter a Chinese boy, scratched and bleeding, who immediately turned to help in the rescue work. He said, "My sister is under there." The rescuers dug furiously. At last, the top of the shelter was uncovered. Beneath was a crushed mass of old men, women, young and old, and young children. Some still living, the rest dead. On the next day, the Straits Times reported that 13th February was probably Singapore's worst day since the fighting began in Malaya. There was almost continuous shelling of the area while air bombardment was heavy. 14th February 1942, the day before. There is to be no Dunkirk in Singapore. Gordon Bennett, Why Singapore Fell. At 1000 hours, Percival held a conference at the municipal offices, former City Hall building in present-day National Gallery, Singapore, following an early morning report from the municipal water engineer that a complete failure in water supply was imminent. During the meeting, it was estimated that with the heavy loss of water as a result of breaks in the water mains and pipes from the bombing and shelling, supply would last for only 48 hours more. Percival ordered for additional assistance from the Royal Engineers to repair the pipes, but this only came in that afternoon, as all available personnel were fighting as combatant troops. Following that, Percival met with Shenton Thomas, then governor of the Straits Settlements, at 10:30 hours at Singapore Club, which was at the former Fullerton building, present-day Fullerton Hotel. Thomas stressed that the dangers that would result should Singapore, with its large population, was suddenly deprived of its water supply. Percival, however, felt otherwise, as he said in his dispatches, "I informed the governor that I intended to go on fighting as long as we could, as I did not consider that the water situation, though undoubtedly serious, had yet rendered the further defense of Singapore impossible." At noontime, around 1300 hours, a group of Japanese soldiers entered the grounds of Alexandra Military Hospital on the pretext of chasing Indian soldiers who had fled to the area. Despite a British officer coming out with a white flag and pointing to his Red Cross armband, the murder and rampage by Japanese soldiers that followed has since become known as the Alexandra Hospital Massacre, where between 150 and 200 patients and staff were killed. That same afternoon, a fierce battle was fought at Bukit Kandu, Opium Hill, where strong resistance by the Malay Regiment was put up against the Japanese army. Here, Lieutenant Aden Saidi of the regiment called a bluff by the Japanese soldiers, and the regiment killed 20 of them in an encounter. In the ensuing battle, however, the Malay Regiment was pushed back. Lieutenant Adnan was captured, hung upside down on a tree, and bayoneted by Japanese soldiers. By 1700 hours, following visits to the formation headquarters of the 18 British and 11 Indian divisions, Percival held another conference at the municipal offices where the municipal water engineer reported that the situation was very slightly better. Director General for Civil Defense, Ivan Simpson, recalled that Percival's departing instructions to him was that I keep a check and report to him again in the morning. Percival wrote that he went home feeling more hopeful. At Fort Canning, we had taken over one of the adjoining houses, and here an improvised mess had been established. The Chinese servants, as usual, rose to the occasion and ran a wonderful show, considering the difficulties and numbers they had to cater for. This is from the Battlebox. Percival had also sent out the following, being a copy of an order from Wavell to Heath. In some units, the troops have not shown the fighting spirit which is to be expected of men of the British Empire. It will be a lasting disgrace if we are defeated by an army of clever gamesters, many times inferior in numbers to our own. The spirit of aggression and determination to stick it out must be inculcated in all ranks. There must be no further thoughts of withdrawal without orders. There are too many fighting men moving about the back areas. Every available man who is not doing other essential work must be used to stop the invader. By the end of the day, practically all the offices, business houses, and shops were closed. The lower floors of many of the large buildings had been taken over as temporary military hospitals. There were few people on the streets. That night, as reported in the final issue of the Sunday Times on the following day, there was a strange diminution of activity, with little shelling and no bombing of the city area. Command Anti-Aircraft Defense. At 9:30 a.m. on the morning of 15th February 1942, the 12 men seen in the diorama in this room gathered for a commander's meeting. The room was likely to have been hot, badly ventilated, and noisy, and probably smelt of diesel. The air filtration plant was just next door, and there was a generator in the room. The night before, Percival had been hopeful. In the war in Malaya, he recounted that on 14th February, he had met with officials at the municipal offices, and the water engineer reported that the situation was slightly better. He had also instructed the Director General of Civil Defense to update him at 7 a.m. of the 15th with an accurate statement of the situation as it appeared at that time. He wrote that, "I thought that with any luck we might be able to master the water difficulty, while the front, in spite of one or two danger spots, the enemy's rate of advance was being slowed down." At 6:30 a.m. on the morning of the 15th, Percival had called for the commander's meeting with the intention of discussing tactical matters and any other matters which might be raised. However, as he later wrote, the first event of the day was a communion service at Fort Canning. But then, the bad news started coming. Director General of Civil Defense, Brigadier Ivan Simpson, had, as requested, updated Percival on the situation of water supply on Singapore Island. Simpson wrote that later at the conference, he had to report that water supplies would probably fail completely within 24 hours, and that it would take several days to restore even the more important supplies. Other updates included those of military food reserves having been reduced to a few days, though there remained fairly large civil reserves. The reserves of field gun and anti-aircraft gun ammunition were running low. There was practically no petrol except in the vehicle's tanks. Percival subsequently wrote that ways and means of overcoming our various difficulties were discussed. None of them was really vital except the water problem. He stressed the danger of the water shortage as it affected the Indian troops, while the danger to civil population was also taken into account. I felt that there was no use in remaining passively defensive as we were. There seemed to be only two alternatives, either to counterattack to regain control of the reservoirs and of the military food depots, and to drive back the enemy's artillery with a view to reducing the damage to the water supply system, or to capitulate. I put these alternatives to the commanders.
This is the room of the Assistant Adjutant and the Quartermaster General.
Are you ready? Forward Defense Headquarters. On the late morning of 15th February 1942, General Officer Commanding Malaya Lieutenant General Arthur Percival and 11 other senior officers made the decision to surrender to the invading Japanese forces. How the officers viewed the situation on hand, what happened at the meeting, and how the decision to capitulate was arrived at can be found in archival records and published memoirs by some of those present. The city is rapidly becoming a shambles. Buildings have collapsed on the occupants. Long holes in the road are unrepaired, and the destructive aerial bombing is continuing unmolested. Our AA fire has become very thin. Each of us, that conference, urged a termination of the hopeless struggle. Dickinson and Simpson told a pitiful tale. The civil hospital had been without water for 24 hours. The civilians were in similar plight. No labor was available to rescue civilians in collapsed buildings. Food supplies were almost depleted. Ammunition, artillery ammunition particularly, was exhausted. Except for the AIF, who had 15 days' supply of food and 400 rounds per gun of artillery and ammunition. Silently and sadly, we decided to surrender. Lieutenant General Gordon Bennett, Commander, Australian Imperial Force. After I reported water failure was imminent at this last conference, General Percival told the commanders present that there were only two alternatives open to us. One was to launch a counterattack in an effort to regain control of the reservoirs and of the military food depots at Bukit Timah area. The other alternative was capitulation. By early morning on February 15th, the Commonwealth Army and a cosmopolitan Asian population of about 1 million people were crowded into a semicircle some 2.5 miles in radius. The sea formed the diameter and further retreat was impossible. All agreed that General Percival was right to surrender. Brigadier Ivan Simpson, Director General of Civil Defense, Singapore. The danger of the water situation, particularly as it affected the Indian troops and vast civil population, was stressed. There was also the danger of a breakthrough into the crowded town area if the Japanese delivered another determined attack. The alternatives were either A, to counterattack, or B, to capitulate. Formation commanders were unanimously of the opinion that in the existing circumstances, a counterattack was impractical. I could see no immediate solution for the critical water situation and decided to capitulate. The other members of the conference concurred unanimously with the decision. Lieutenant General Arthur Ernest Percival. On the same afternoon, Percival, together with Major Cyril Weil and his interpreter Brigadier Newbigging and Brigadier General Torrance, went to the Ford factory at Bukit Timah area to meet Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita to discuss the surrender. The strength and casualties of both of the Allied and Japanese armies for campaign were estimated as follows. Troops, all ranks, Allied forces 190,246. Japanese forces 125,408. Aircraft 253. For Allies, Japanese 799. Artillery pieces 810 for the Allies and 440 for the Japanese. Fortress guns 44 for the Allies. Anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns 208 for the Allies. Armored fighting vehicles 250 for the Allies. Tanks, none for the Allies and 265 for Japanese forces. Motor vehicles 15 to 400 and for Japanese 3,000 and plus trucks. Killed for the Allies 7,500 to 8,000. For the Japanese forces 3,507. Wounded Allied forces 11,000, Japanese 6,150. Prisoners of war 120,000 captured or missing. Controversies, myths, and facts surrounding the causes and decisions leading to the fall of Singapore and the surrender have been much written about. Between Two Oceans, a military history of Singapore, from first settlement to the final British withdrawal by Malcolm Murphy and Brian Farrell and Shannon Ming Shun provides a good starting point into this discussion. Here is Percival going to surrender. And here is General Yamashita. According to Percival, there was only one copy of the terms of surrender produced by the Japanese army, and that was obtained by them, and no copy handed to him. As Percival remembers it, the main terms of surrender were: A, there must be an unconditional surrender of all military forces, Army, Navy, and Air Force, in the Singapore area. B, hostilities to cease at 2030 hours, British time, 2300 hours, Japanese time. All troops to remain in position occupied at the time of cessation of hostilities, pending further orders. D, all weapons, military equipment, ships, aeroplanes, and secret documents to be handed over to the Japanese army intact. E, in order to prevent looting and other disorders in Singapore town during the temporary withdrawal of all armed forces, a force of 100 British armed men to be left temporarily in the town area until relieved by the Japanese. Here are quotes from Lieutenant General Henry Gordon Bennett, Inspector General Arthur Harold Dickinson, Brigadier Eric Whitlock Goodman, Lieutenant General Sir Louis Macclesfield Heath, Brigadier Hubert Francis Lucas, Brigadier Thomas Kennedy Newby, Major General Frank Keith Simmons, Director General Ivan Simpson, Brigadier General Kenneth Sanderson Torrance, Major Cyril Hugh Dalrymple Wild, Brigadier Alec Maureen Greenlaw Wildy, Lieutenant General Arthur Ernest Percival. This room was occupied by the commander of fixed defenses from 1939 to 1942, Brigadier Arthur Drury Curtis. Fixed defenses was divided into fire commands, i.e. the Changi Fire Command, which covered the approaches to the naval base, and the Faber Fire Command, which covered the approaches to Keppel Harbor and to the western channel of the Johor Straits. In each fire command was one 15-inch and one 9.2-inch battery, and a number of 6-inch batteries, also searchlights and smaller equipment. In the war in Malaya, Percival recalls Curtis as a most efficient artillery officer and an expert in coast defense. Prior to Singapore, Curtis had been chief instructor at the Coast Artillery School and the commandant of the Coast Artillery School. He retired in 1946. Command Fixed Defenses. This room was occupied by the commander of Fixed Defenses from 1939 to 1942, Brigadier Arthur Drury Curtis. Fixed Defenses was divided into fire commands, as we already discussed. In the war in Malaya, Percival recalls Curtis as a most efficient artillery officer and an expert in coast defense. After the battle, following the end of the Japanese occupation in 1945, the British Army in Singapore used the two 3-story above-ground buildings on Fort Canning as the Singapore Base District headquarters. Subsequently, the complex became the headquarters of the 4th Malaysian Infantry Brigade. After independence in 1965, the Singapore Armed Forces converted the premises into the Singapore Command and Staff College. Present-day Fort Canning Centre was the former Army barracks, while the building which houses present-day Hotel Fort Canning was the site of the headquarters of the Far East Command and Lieutenant General Percival's office. The Battlebox, however, fell into general disuse until the 1980s when, through the efforts of then Oral History Department Director Kwa Chong Wan and then National University of Singapore history lecturer and consultant with National Parks Board, John Leaksik, attention was drawn once again to it. The Battlebox is managed by Global Cultural Alliance, a not-for-profit arts and culture organization. Admission to the site is free for all. Please consider making a donation to support our work at the Battlebox. Partial proceeds from every contribution will support the Engage initiative.